Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our session on Synge and counter-performance traditions. This is a great opportunity to congratulate Hélène Lecossois on the publication of her book on Synge, which we're going to be discussing tonight. I'll introduce her in a moment, but I'm also going to introduce our panelists who've joined us today to talk about the book and her contribution. We have three speakers, and the first person who'll be speaking is Alice Maher. Alice is one of Ireland's leading contemporary artists. She works within realms of nature and culture, subversion and transformation, mythology and memory. She's worked in various different media: painting, drawing, sculpture, print, photography, and installation, in fact. She is one of Ireland's best known visual artists, in fact. She represented Ireland at the 23rd Sao Paulo Biennial, for example. Her first exhibition was in 1994 in the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Dublin. She works in non-traditional materials on embodiment and identity. In 2012, the Irish Museum of Modern Art presented Alice Maher Becoming, a retrospective of her 30 years of practice. And she also works collaboratively in theater, dance, and performance. Her collections have featured in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Neuberger Museum, the British Museum, the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris, the Ulster Museum, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art. She was elected to Esdana in 1997, and she's a founder member of the Artists' Campaign to Repeal the Eighth Amendment. Adrian Paterson is a lecturer in English at the National University of Ireland, Galway. He has published widely on 18th century, 19th, and 20th century literature, from pianos to poems, with a particular interest in the artistic interactions between modernism and Irish literature. He's the co-editor with Tom Walker and Charles Armstrong of the forthcoming Edinburgh Companion to W.B. Yeats and the Arts, and with Christine Régnier, 2 special issues of the Era Journal of Modernist Nonfiction. And he's director of the Yeats through Ballet Society and current president of Modernist Studies Ireland. And they have, in fact, their seminar and symposium coming up on the 9th of June. So that's something else to look forward to. Shaun Richards is Emeritus Professor of Irish Studies at Staffordshire University. He is the co-author of Writing Ireland, Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture, 1988, editor of the Cambridge Companion to Irish Drama, 2004, and co-author with Chris Morash of Mapping Irish Theatre, Theories of Space and Place in 2013. His most recent book is Contemporary Irish Documentary Theatre, 2020, which he co-edited with Beatriz Kopschitz-Bastos. And now coming to the person who has brought us together, in a sense, today with her contribution. Hélène Lecossois is professor of Irish literary studies at the University of Lille in France. The primary focus of her research is the relationship of theater to history. Her other research interests include modernism, 20th century Irish drama, post-colonial and performance studies. Her latest publications include the book that we are launching today, Performance, Modernity in the Plays of J.M. Synge, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. And she's also recently co-edited Resurgence conflictuelle, le travail de mémoire entre art et histoire, which was published by the Presse Universitaire de Rennes in 2020. Absolutely delighted to have people here, and thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start with Alice, and Alice is going to share some slides with us. Very much looking forward to your presentation. So Alice, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say how honored I am that Hélène requested the use of one of my images, for this book, and I'm doubly honored to be asked to speak about it, because I'm sure it's not very often that the cover of the book gets top billing, but it may speak to the kind of subject I'm going to speak to you for a short while today, which is the subject of the hybrid. And the hybrid as a figure, not necessarily, throughout my own work, but, as a kind of cultural phenomenon, which comes into focus for me in the language and work of somebody like Synge, where this kind of undercurrent of generational language and meaning seems to come to us like through the wormholes of time. And that comes, I think, from very deep listening. And I don't mean listening to words and their meanings. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Okay. Okay. And I'm going to go into presentation. Somebody was going to tell me where that was. Okay, where is that?
If you see the buttons
I
at
see
the
it. I
bottom,
see it. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's so many little switches. So, I mean, my whole practice as an artist could be called a hybrid practice because I work in so many different languages and kind of bring them together. So I work in drawing, for instance. These are very large drawings, about 15 foot tall, charcoal on paper. Each of those drawings is called ombre, which of course means shadow or shade. I work in painting, and this work you see here, the red painting, is called Familiar, and it works with its familiar, which is this great skein of flax, which you see hanging from a peg in the wall. I work with, that's drawing, painting. I work in sculpture. This piece is called Double Venus, where I took the kind of 18th century Canova classical Venus, the goddess of love, doubled her and joined her two looking in opposite direction faces or heads with this kind of serpentine joining that joins them together. I work in photography. And this work is from 2003, which was a whole series of portraits, self-portraits, which kind of turns the portrait in a way on its head in that I haven't shown my face as a portrait. So that's something I'd like to talk about as well in terms of representation. So here in these portraits, I use the artist's own materials as an identification of the self. And I also work in film. This film was called Cassandra's Necklace, was made in 2012, and of course explores that the seer of Troy, as you all know, who could tell the future, but of course was cursed with the fact that nobody would ever believe her. And I also work in print, and it's one of these images which Hélène chose for the front cover of her book. So my practice over the 30 years would really have looked at, I think, representation of the human form, and particularly the human female form. So I would be trying to kind of explore not what it looks like to be a human form, but what it's like to be human, not to see the human, but to be human, and all the kind of complexity of the habitation of this human form. So I often enter and kind of reprise maybe mythological and folkloric narratives to kind of search for that form. And it's always there. Even when it's not there, its absence makes it part of the mythological and folkloric narrative. The work for these prints, so I'm going to start with the image of the mermaid, which I found, well, I didn't find, it was there all the time in my own landscape, which is in South Tipperary, Kilkenny, that kind of Norman hybrid landscape again between the Gaelic world and the Norman world. And on the wall of this abbey, Kilcooley Abbey, very near where I come from, was this beautiful carving, 12th century carving of a mermaid, which I had seen as a child, but just accepted. But then as an adult, I thought, why is there a mermaid like so far from her element, so far inland with these two beautiful familiars, her salmon and her carp? And of course, then I noticed that this mermaid is actually manacled. I'd never seen that before. You see that around her tail, there's a manacle where she's tied. And at this time, it might be instructive to say as well, this is like 2015, 2016. So the whole kind of struggle for reproductive rights for women is really reaching an apex, at this time. So this figure of the kind of manacled monster female, you might say, was very big in my imagination. So then I'm trying to think, how do I represent that in two-dimensional form? So of course, I start with my own body, as I usually do. I don't do what's called life drawing, where you look at somebody and draw them as a person. I actually try to go inside myself and understand what it feels like to be in that position with that weight, as a person. So I began to move around my studio, and friend, my partner, or anyone who was there would take pictures of me in different positions from different angles, not from the regular angle where you see a person and they pose for a photograph, head, 4 limbs, but from all different angles. And my idea was that I was going to make silhouettes, you know, of the outline of this figure, which changes your whole understanding of what it is. And the silhouette is a very interesting way of making an image also, because of course it was like an 18th century kind of poor man's portraiture, because when you couldn't afford to have a massive, you know, oil painting of yourself like Napoleon or somebody painted, you could have a little silhouette cut out and that would give you kind of your identity. So I decided to use wood, you know, as a very natural material, very simple. So we just cut around the outline. So I did a drawing of these different positions that I was in, cut out the outline, and I was going to print from the wood. So I don't know if any of you have ever done print, but it's very simple. You ink up your piece of wood, you put the paper on top, roll it through the press, you put pressure on it. So you like press an image out. So that's what I did in the printers in Limerick, parallel editions. And I wanted them to be quite big, nearly as close as human size as I could. And the only wood they told me they could get was the cheapest old hardwood, you know, like sheets of hardwood. So I said, that's okay, we'll use the hardwood. We cut it out and printed it. But then when I printed it through, this great surprise came to me, which were the figures. Because the wood was this cheap kind of hardwood, it had all these knots and what the printers call mistakes in the wood. The wood itself, you know, actually made an image in the interior of the silhouette. And you had these giant eyes and holes and orifices and ears and all the kind of openings into the human body, which connect us in a way to the outside world, you know, to the universe, or how we try to connect to the universe. And then these are actually hand tinted. That's where the color, the paint comes from. So of course it made me think of, and I really am interested in medieval, you know, medieval imagery from these kind of natural histories like Pliny or later, where they refer to the monstrous others, you know, the monstrous races which lived outside of civilization, before civilization, and beyond where we understand the limits of civilization are. So in a way, these figures that I had, you know, cut out as silhouettes of myself, you know, gain some kind of other language through the wood, you know, through actually fusing with a natural product, as it were, which has its own voice. So I would contend that the wood brings its voice to my work, and that we kind of work together to make these works, as it were. And here are some more of them. So you can imagine that one there on the right. That was a photograph, I think, that, you know, Dermot might have taken of me from, you know, the top of the stairs where I had my hands, you know, out like that. So it was amazing experience in a way when, and I think this is what should happen really if your art is any good in a way. It should bring you something yourself, you know, as an artist that you do not expect from the work. And I think that's what happened, you know, with these prints. It brought me these kind of monstrous kind of otherness through the actual medium of the wood itself. The wood's own language, you know, spoke in a way through me, or I spoke through it. And that's the kind of subject of the hybrid that I am speaking to you about. And you might be interested that along with these 8 woodblock prints, which moved along like a type of language also, you know, on the wall there, was a group of sculptures, which I made very, very simply by pressing wax in my fists and getting different shapes from the wax. And of course, to do something like that is almost like a pre-language expression, you know, like a baby would press their fists together before they even ever spoke. So I'm kind of referring to that kind of pre-language or non-language or misunderstood language of the mermaid in a way, because you probably all know the story of the Little Mermaid. The real story of the Little Mermaid is that she had to give up her voice to become human. So her tongue was torn out so that she could have human legs. So it's really like the whole subject of the installation together is about language, about pre-language and post-language, and some kind of language that can come together through fusion. And I just put this in at the end because you may be interested that I was working just before lockdown on a piece with a dance company called Junk Ensemble called The Misunderstanding of Maher, which is of course another hybrid figure, Maher, who turns into a tree. So I think my 10 minutes might be up now. Is it, Dan? I'm not too sure. So
you're in very good time, actually.
I'm in good time. I may be going a little bit too fast, but you know, I wanted to show you really the, you know, where that work had come about that Hélène chose to go with her work, you know, which is another hybrid for me, you know, of for my work now to go with this work and to be somehow in relation with Synge, which I'm very, very honored, you know, to be as well. So, so that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And I want to thank you very much for asking me, you know, to talk about that, because I don't know exactly how book covers, you know, are chosen. But for me, this one is very significant, you know, that Hélène chose this. And for me, it's actually the perfect fit for her writing. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alice, very much. That's great. It really outstanding images there to engage with. So we're now going to turn to Shaun. So Shaun, if I could invite you now to speak.
Yeah. Okay. You can hear me, I hope.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, good. Well, Felicitation. There's a line early in Hélène's book saying how it was now normative to think of Synge's plays in the context of Druid theatres productions of his work. And this brought back some memories of, in fact, the first Synge play that I'd ever seen. It was, in fact, the first Irish play I'd ever seen. And this was the October of 1982, when I went on a trip to Dublin with some colleagues, my first trip not only to Dublin, but my first trip to Ireland. And we went by chance, nothing pre-booked, to the Gaiety Theatre. And we saw Playboy of the Western World in Druid's landmark production. It obviously didn't hit me as it did the original audience of 1907. I certainly wasn't outraged and shocked, but I was surprised because all I'd seen of Synge to that point, and that quite recently, was a film of Playboy starring Siobhan McKenna, which dated from the early 1960s. And if people have seen the film, they might recall the sunny brightness of the weather, the shiny red dress that Pegeen is wearing, and perhaps most strikingly of all, her bare, perfectly clean feet walking on the equally pristine floor of the shebeen. Well, if that was your memory of it, and then you see the Druid production with the bucket that catches drips of rain from the roof, the fact that Pegeen probably needed that fine-tooth comb to get rid of nits. And of course, these productions are both interpretations, directorial choices, something we'll touch on later. What we do know about the set for the first production is that it had lime-washed walls and turf brown fittings. We also know that the early Abbey was a poor theatre, both materially and technically. As Lady Gregory observed, we all tried to write for as little scene shifting as might be, for economy of scenery and stagehands. And so as Playboy was in fact the second piece on a double bill with Riders to the Sea, they shared the same set. It was generic enough to be both a cottage on the Aran Islands and a shebeen in Mayo. But difference of location was signaled by the artifacts. Nets, oilskins, spinning wheel in Riders, bottles, jugs, barrels in Playboy. And Synge was insistent on the authenticity of these objects, writing to Lady Gregory requesting 4 red petticoats, Aran men's caps, and a spinning wheel. As stressed by Frank Fay, one of the company's directors, the characters were dressed exactly as in real life, and the properties are absolutely correct. This, of course, is the world of dramatic realism, the style pioneered by André Antoine in Paris, followed by other European art theatres, and adopted quite consciously by the Fay brothers at the Abbey. References to the Boer War in Playboy indicate that the onstage action is more contemporaneous with the time of the first production in 1907. It's realism of time, but not of location, because this is not the world of the audience. It's then unlike the European realism of Ibsen, who of course Synge rejects in the Playboy, preface to the Playboy. It's realism then, but of a distinct and qualified kind. Now, Hélène makes the point that in taking these authentic objects from the west of Ireland and staging them in Dublin, what is emphasized is the distance between those locations, one which is temporal, perhaps even more than spatial, for they are, as she says, remnants of a purportedly dying culture, which confirms the audience in its sense of its own modernity. Now, Synge's relationship to that dying culture was complex. He was a European intellectual. He spent time on the continent. He certainly spoke French well enough to attend lectures at the Sorbonne. He possessed all the accoutrements of modernity: a pocket watch, a camera, a typewriter which was a Blickensderfer No. 5, a portable American model. All of this is the opposite of life on the Aran island of Inishmaan, which he judged to be perhaps the most primitive left in Europe. And simple, natural, primitive are the words he uses to describe the islanders, but not from a position of superiority, because those are the qualities he values. As to enter that world gave him, he said, exquisite satisfaction. But as he notes in the preface to the Playboy, such qualities exist in Ireland only for a few years more, before they are erased by, in his words, the ruthlessness of progress. This is the modernity which in Riders to the Sea made it difficult to identify the body of the drowned Michael by the material of his shirt, as there are great rolls of it in the shops of Galway, and isn't it many another man who may have a shirt of it as well? His identity is only confirmed by the hand-knitted sock, identified by his sister Nora as the second one of the third pair she knitted. The point is that the life and culture valorized by Synge is being eroded, is seen by him as being so, indeed dramatized as being so. The natural qualities of the islanders been replaced, he says, by the anxiety of men who are eager for gain. Indigenous Irish culture was under threat from more than the modernity, the materialism of an urban bourgeoisie. From the middle of the 19th century, it was threatened by the devotional revolution led by Cardinal Paul Cullen, which sought to restrict folk practices such as wakes and saints' days, because they were seen as the occasions of licentiousness and drunkenness. In his record of a funeral on the Aran Islands, Synge notes the presence of Catholicism, as he records, an old man kneeled down by the grave and repeated a simple prayer for the dead. But, and crucially, he then observes, there was an irony in these words of atonement and Catholic belief, spoken by voices still hoarse with the cries of pagan desperation. This is the keen, what Synge described as the crying for the dead. But in the idea that this is the deep structure of grief over which is layered Catholic ritual, we see Synge's subjective preference as to the actuality of the belief system of the islanders. As Hélène tellingly observes, most of Synge's plays are set within the larger context of affair, which were famous, she says, for unregulated performance traditions and unregulated emotions, all opposed to the rationality of modernity. And it's those very pre-modern practices that Synge powerfully dramatizes. The keen, which ends both Riders to the Sea and Playboy of the Western World. The wake, which is the central focus in Shadow of the Glen. The lives of the blind beggars in The Well of the Saints, and the tinkers of Tinker's Wedding. Indeed, as Mary, the old tinker woman, says to the priest at the end of that play, "It's little need we ever had of the like of you to get us our bite to eat, our bit to drink, our time of love when we were young men and women." But the preface to that play, as in so much of Synge's writing, carries the valedictory note for what has been lost. And the powerful thesis at the heart of Hélène's book is that in the performance of these pre-modern practices, there's a resistance to the inevitable demise of that culture. Or more precisely, in the way these acts are performed, there's a resistance. Let me perhaps quote directly her comment on Riders to the Sea. The dynamic of that important final scene lies precisely in the tension between these two modalities of performance. That is the narrative drive, which points to the death of the culture as captured in Moria's words, and its continuing powerful presence on stage in the keen. But, Hélène argues, if the keen is downplayed, it acquiesces in the death of the culture. If it unfolds in what she describes as all its trance-like wildness, then it intimates possible access to other levels of consciousness, especially as this is occurring at the end of the play, when audiences are released from the fictional world of the stage back into the real world. And if we go back to the first productions and recall that Riders to the Sea and Playboy, both of which end on a keen, were a double bill, then the plays echoed one another in striking the extended note of the pre-modern. In this sense, to take a formulation of Frederick Jameson, our concrete relationship with the past remains an existential experience, a galvanic and electrifying event. In this, as Hélène notes, Synge allows for the voice of the subaltern not to be suppressed. But the extent to which the keen can be performed as a counterpoint to the modernizing drive of the narrative depends, she says, on a director's decision to leave space for the performance practice of social transformations which modernity discarded. In other words, the Syngean text is not fixed, but malleable, open to transformation in performance. So as I was reading Hélène's book, engaging with its argument, I started to think, well, okay, this idea of the keen as a point of resistance might work in 1907, when audiences, although urban, might have a cultural memory of pre-modern practices. But what of contemporary Ireland? What of productions in places other than Ireland? Well, let me just quote Hélène's response to my unasked question. She says, the performance of a keen is not about the historical memory of the practice, but about an awakening of consciousness. As Alice has said, she's talking about things coming through the wood, the past emerging through the wormholes of time. Synge's engagement with the pre-modern still entering and affecting our modern moment. This, one might say, is utopian thinking. But as Oscar Wilde said, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at. Thank you, Hélène.
Thank you, Shaun. That was terrific. And I was thinking of your fateful visit to Dublin. Was a very productive encounter from
Thought of everything.
Moment. Yeah, wonderful. We'll come back to those themes, no doubt. So Adrian, now if I could invite you to give your thoughts.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm just going to share a screen here as well, if that's all right with you. Is that working? Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
When Synge went back to the Aran Islands for the third or fourth time, he took with him his violin. And naturally enough, he was expecting this. He was asked to play for a dance. And his description of the scene in his book, The Aran Islands, is itself kind of interesting. It's characteristically spare, but I think kind of wonderfully revealing. As he says, at first I tried to play standing, but on the upward stroke, my bow came in contact with the saltfish and oilskins that hung from the rafters. So I settled myself at last on a table in the corner where I was out of the way and got one of the people to hold up my music before me as I had no stand. It's not hard, I think, to read this bothersome intrusion of saltfish and oilskins symbolically as representing, if you like, the chastening intervention of real things into what had seemed a narrowly aesthetic realm. They also have the effect of pushing the performer rather rudely off stage. He's now as much spectator as performer. And both of these aspects, seems to me, have become vitally important to Synge's artistic development. After all, he's to become a playwright, observing and directing from the wings as others take center stage. And his work, however finely constructed, is of course sown with the fruits of that observation, that salt tang of reality. At least these were the kind of things I concluded when I was thinking about this passage some years ago. And then I was concentrating a bit more on the kind of classically trained Synge's half-conscious naming of his violin as a fiddle, a translation into a kind of demotic idiom that prefigures the kind of musical translations he's going to make. And actually the failure of these translations, the whole party breaks up when this ersatz fiddler, Synge, who can only play from a musical score, can't find common musical ground with an older man, the best dancer on the island, who did not know the dances in my book, so they can't meet really. This kind of missed encounter is representative, if you like, of the collision, and also I think the coexistence of oral and literate cultures. And here they're performed musically. But having had the pleasure of reading Hélène Lecossois' thoughtful and penetrating new book, an experience I warmly recommend to all of you, my sense of such scenes, I think, is richer and laced with infinitely more context and nuance. Now, I knew, for instance, that Synge was already an accomplished performer. He was trained at Conservatoire in Germany as a violinist and pianist, and was able to impress with his violin tone the very finest player of the Blasket Islands, who in Synge's West Carey says, or admits he has never seen anyone the like of you for moving your hand and getting the sound out of it with a full drag of the bow. But Hélène's book has enhanced my sense of Synge as someone necessarily and self-consciously attentive to all aspects of performance. So in this example here, for instance, he's very careful to kind of test out the audience before he starts in the acoustics. He says here, I was going to move my thing here. Yeah, I played a French melody first to get myself used to the people and the qualities of the room, which has little resonance between the earth floor and the thatch overhead. And then he strikes up a popular jig, and what happens at a moment, a tall man bounds out from his stool under the chimney and began flying around the kitchen with peculiarly sure and graceful bravado. There's a kind of sense in which the naive extravagance, is the Synge's word for this kind of performance, suggests a good deal of acquired skill. And actually towards at the end of Hélène's book is a really interesting discussion about how performance culture prizes virtuosity. But not only virtuosity, to her credit, she uses this to open up the topic of risk, the possibility of failure. Something, in fact, Synge himself has to combat here, because actually, as the dance gets going, the speed, he says, however, was so violent that I had some difficulty in keeping up, as my fingers were not in practice, and I could not take off more than a small part of my attention to watch what was going on. So there's a really interesting thing here that happens. In trying to keep up as a performer, he's nearly missing his supposedly real role as a spectator to this new performance. In other words, the roles have been reversed here of performance, and Synge's at once a performer among other performers and also a spectator among spectators in a culture that allows and indeed expects this kind of constant interplay of performance roles. So helping us read the nuances of moments like this seems to me a major advance of Hélène's study. We notice how, as Synge now in his role as guiding narrator, is actually trying to reassert some agency. He notes indeed the arrangements of the audience, how they're divided by gender. In fact, when I'd finished, the body of the people who had come down to watch the quarrel filed into the room and arranged themselves around the walls, the women and girls, as is usual, forming themselves in one compact mass, crouching on their heels near the door. So there's a sense in which there's a kind of audience, new audience space created here. And as a narrator, he notices this. Actually, it's most crucially maybe that these performances are nested within and encroached upon by other performances, right? As described in the Aran Islands, this scene of music and dancing is framed both physically and temporally by the clamor of a married couple who are arguing at this loud quarrel that happens. And as we open out the scene, or as we begin the scene, actually, the news of it had gone about the island and little bands of girls and boys were running along the lanes towards the scene of the quarrel as eagerly as if they were going to a race course. In other words, this is its own kind of performance. I mean, maybe a kind of comic moment here. At the end of the whole musical performance, actually the household is kind of kept awake by the music and starts discussing music. And in fact, what happens, it becomes fantastical. From ordinary music, Synge says, we came to talk to the music of fairies, and they told me this story when I had told them some stories of my own. So there's a kind of sense in which there's interlocking exchanges of performance. And this contributes, I think, very well to Hélène's overall sense of wider Irish culture as invested in performance of all kinds, in an exchange economy animated by different concerns potentially than the surrounding capitalist modernity. Now, I should stress this is my particular example, and so Hélène should not be taken to task for any of my readings here. But and indeed, sometimes my own readings might stress rather less this particular opposition between modernity and the past. But it seems to me the central revelation of this book is to take this dual conception of the world of performance and the world as performance, and imagine or investigate a playwright navigating those connections. Holding Synge's work up to the light makes these powerful tensions between the world of performance, the world as performance, become kind of manifest, visible, even sometimes audible, and creative, I think, as well. There's a kind of real interesting creativity that's happening here. I can't really hope to sum up the kind of varied insights that might flow from a premise like this. I thought I would try, in the spirit of performance, to kind of illustrate a few. As you know, I'm kind of hyper aware that academic talks where you just see your face can be to students kind of boring. So I'm attempting some kind of visual counterpoint to the things that I'm saying. And in a sense, this is one of my favorite illustrations, this particular handbill for the Celynine Feis of August 1902. And in a sense, this is designed to illustrate in a certain way how Hélène's simple observation about how many of Synge's plays actually involve characters on the way to a fair, astonishing number of plays that involve the potential affair off stage, leads to a kind of larger discussion of the unregulated performance traditions of the country fair. As the Playboy has it, the racing, leaping, dancing, and the Lord knows what. Now, in this particular 1902 Celynine Feis, we're not quite observing, I think, what Hélène calls the Rabelaisian rowdiness of oral culture, that's clearly there. In fact, we kind of have a sense of a real strict local organization of these revival things, a highly organized festival of the applied arts. Prizes will be given for Irish singing, dancing, storytelling, flute playing, etc., says the caption. But crucially, though, I think it, like Hélène's book, suggests that the bounds and modes of performance are permeable. This wonderfully mustachioed figure, I don't know if you can see my cursor actually, but I'm circling him, so if you can, he's on the bottom right there, is actually Douglas Hyde. He's acting in one of his own Irish plays, probably, and Irish language plays, I should say. And he's kind of juxtaposed with that kind of unidentified dancer, as if in some way, part of the same kinds of scenes. And even the kind of more detached figures like W.B. Yeats or Lady Gregory, who are kind of sitting or standing, depending on their temperament, as spectators are themselves kind of posed and observed here. And indeed, the kind of sharply observed doodles remind me of the care of Synge's observations of people observing, which he does a lot. And of course, these drawings are by Jack B. Yeats, named, let me move my own face from the thing, on the left there is the artist, who in the years following, of course, collaborates with Synge on a series of articles for the Manchester Guardian as the pair go walking in Carey and Wicklow and Galway, Connemara. We don't know what they talked about, but maybe they didn't say anything. They were kind of prone to silence mostly, but as observers and performers in this Western world as performance, they're kind of unmatched. So I have a few more illustrations of this from Jack B. Yeats's broadsides, where he's clearly spending his time observing a whole lot of series of performers with a certain kind of pride and intensity and poise, even in their clothing, as well as an audience of a kind, a very limited audience of one sometimes. And it seems to me that's the kind of thing that Synge was doing too, both in these prose articles and in his plays as well. He's observing different kinds of performance and the audience of those things. And it's not, I think, I should be careful to say, it's not just so much that you can map these outside performance worlds onto the plays. That's not what the book does at all. I mean, Hélène notes that Synge's outsider position reads very differently according to its circumstance, in a theatre box, a London salon, or an Arran cottage. And much of the interesting tension in the book seems to me comes from the examination of the discrepancies and collisions between specific performance practices inside and outside the theatre, and how they kind of invest the theatre with a certain kind of strangeness and unruliness in performance space, whether that's what in the Playboy riots, or as Hélène's very careful to call them, the protests of the Playboy, or things like the audience to Douglas Hyde's Irish language play Cassat and Sugon, and Moore and Yeats's Dom and Grania, which is kind of almost like an opera. It's got Elgar's music in it. In the interval, the audience break into kind of old Irish songs, where Synge in a French journal senses the soul of the people hovering in the auditorium. The kind of performance that's not part of the play is as important as the thing that is part of it. And it's such a fantastic, interesting 1901 Gaiety Theatre moment, not quite like Shaun's, I think, but rather different Gaiety Theatre moment, but still deserves, I think, examination, because it's so interesting, all the different kind of cultural and political and performance traditions kind of coming together in a surprising way. I mean, as Shaun has noted, that thread that winds through the text is an analysis, probably, I'm sure, building on work that's been done at NUI Galway, of the disruptive bodies and sounds of the Keen, both in the cultural context and in the plays themselves, as the Keen arrives in Riders to the Sea, Playboy, Deirdre, The Sorrows. I mean, really diverse plays, actually. And Synge's comment at the Dublin International Exhibition at Herbert Park in May 1907, that the Somali war song was exactly like some of the Keens of Arran, draws a whole chapter on such exhibitions and their kind of conscious ethnographic framing of primitive, so-called primitive life, yet finally diagnoses in these performers a limited but vital agency that allows them to go beyond just the subjected other. As I think Shaun has mentioned, so perhaps I'll skip over it, but performance is not just about orality and sound and bodies, but it's also about things, right? And in theatre language, those are props. And on stage, things become kind of representative things. And as you know, really interesting work done on the kind of particular kind of textiles that matter to present a recreation of the authentic. That's the phrase that Hélène uses, I think, in Riders to the Sea, particularly. Lady Gregory says, "We, Synge and I, are still struggling with the things for his play. He has to deal with Arran Islanders, I with nuns." But that word recreation does an awful lot of work. It seems to me that, you know, the actual choice of these textile colors depends on not only the dyes available for the textiles and the shops that you can buy them in, whether local or department stores, or actually directly from the islands themselves, but also on the lights of the theatre. So what looks interesting on stage, not necessarily what will actually be the real thing. That reminded me of this kind of, I don't know if you can see the kind of colors of Jack B. Yeats's things, in which there's a kind of performance, even in clothing here, in different places, in clearly a country town and in the west of Ireland somewhere, in which that color red is kind of used as this kind of self-fashioning So even in clothing, Synge's desire seems to me not just for kind of realism, which has, as Shaun has pointed out, its own kind of particular conventions that stems from French naturalism and other things that Hélène traces beautifully, but also a kind of self-conscious, self-fashioned performance. And even the possibility that you might incorporate the smell into the drama actually draws from French symbolist theatre as opposed to kind of naturalist theatre. So what I earlier called the salt tang of reality matters. But on rereading the Aran Islands, Yeats himself was impressed by the knowledge of the real life of Ireland, which goes into the creation of a world which is yet as fantastic as the Spain of Cervantes. In other words, knowledge of real life is not quite the same thing as reality or realism. And actually the kind of performance that is described by these plays is very much interested in, again, these performance spaces and contests and other outcomes. And that seems to me, you know, a really interesting insight, and all finally comes back, as Hélène and Yeats agree, I think, it all comes back to Synge's work on the Aran Islands, that narrative partaking of the travelogue, the autobiography, and the ethnographical recording, as Hélène puts it. And you might say kind of folklore collection and performance space and those other things. So those Synge claims there to be inventing nothing, changing nothing, it seems to me a kind of scrupulously revised and curated book of nested performances, as sure as this Playboy, which is Jack B. Yeats' representative of the character of the Playboy, has a stance and a pose, and even a jockey's silks here, he imagines, is kind of still creating himself as something important, as Christy Mahan does in the play. Now, I'm very comfortable with the idea of oral and literate culture coexisting. So I follow Walter J. Ong as much as David Lloyd on that sort of thing. And maybe I'm instinctively less certain about the progress-oriented narrative of the theatre of modernity, which Hélène so interestingly describes. But I would most certainly concur with the final determination that, notwithstanding Synge's ethnographic readings and his, you know, potential belief that the Irish language is terminally in decline, in his hands, she finds the stage is not a museum. It's not an archive. It's not even Beckett's space of endless crushing repetition, but it's a place of life and uncertainty, of revival, sometimes a literal revivification, where fathers and husbands rise from the dead or the apparent dead and disrupt the action. And even within limits, a place of freedom. And that seems to me a really important insight. And we can expect a book like this to affect readings, not just of Synge's work, but, you know, other preoccupations of the modernists. One thinks of Conrad's ethnographic treatments in Heart of Darkness, or even the voyeuristic, self-conscious performance nest of Finnegan's Wake, when kind of reanimation of Irish cliches puts the fun back into funeral practices, and like Synge's plays, blurs into comedy. Anyway, but it's a really rich book, and I recommend it to all of you. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Adrian. That was great. I mean, these talks altogether have some fascinating interplay between them. I'll just invite Hélène in a moment to respond, but thank you very much for those comments, which really took us from, I guess, the visual to the physical and the performative, to looking at the artist in the work and the artist hidden in the work as well. So I think some fascinating things to dwell on. So Hélène, yeah, would you like to respond and comment and tell us a little bit more about, you know, about your relationship to this book that you've written?
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I would indeed, I'll say a few words, and I won't be long, but well, first of all, thank you. I'll say a few thank yous, which I mean, like, thanks, Dan, for suggesting the you know, in the first place, to have this webinar and for hosting it. I'd like to thank also David Kelly for making it possible from behind the scene. And obviously, a big profuse thank you to the three speakers for their engagement with the book. And Alice, thanks for sharing so generously and explaining, you know, how you work, the process, and how your art accommodates accidents. I was, you know, I was very much interested in how, from these so-called accidents or failures or mistakes, I think is the word you used, something opens up and something you know, this discussion between you and your art. So I thought that this sort of how this you know, the wood brings its own voice to your art, which basically that's what drew me to Vox Hybrida in the first place. I'll say a few words about that in a minute. Shaun, wonderful to hear you share your experience of things, and thank you for such a generous reading of the book, and for contextualizing so well and recalling the history of the productions, and this idea which is close to my heart, that the Synge text is not fixed, and so the malleability of the text is something that I'm interested in, and thank you for pointing that out. And Adrian, well, I like the bringing in of other performances, like the musical performances, even the you know, the material that you showed in Jack B. Yeats's painting, and for your, you know, your engaging, or in things, how Synge navigates the world as performance. So you all have opened up the book and sort of broadened its scope. So thanks for that. Also a word about the Moore Institute and why this event is taking place here. Well, partly because I'm indebted to the Moore Institute for, you know, I received a fellowship from the Moore in 2014, and that's where really the ideas of the book germinated. And they germinated because of this, or thanks to this hospitable environment that I found at NUI Galway, at the library, at the Moore, with colleagues from the English department, and colleagues from the Irish Studies Centre, and also probably because of my life, which takes me from the west of Ireland to France regularly, and this backing and forthing really has encouraged a constant readjustment of my perspective on things, and on Synge as well. As regard the book itself, I'll just say two things. It's basically organized around the productive tension between, or the tension created rather, by different ways of engaging with the past, by different ways of remembering. And it comes from the belief that societies remember differently in movement than they do in writing. Basically, I'm sort of fascinated by the capacity of performance to disrupt narratives of progress, to challenge representation, and to offer alternatives. So it's in that respect that the book pays particular attention to Synge's interest in keening, which I argue can be thought about as a ritual of female empowerment. And in that, I'm indebted to the scholarly work of Angela Burke, especially. So rather than you know, sort of coming back to what Shaun said earlier, you know, what it's all very well keen, you know, in 1904, but what about in 2021? Well, you know, it's not about apprehending the Keane as some form of nostalgic tribute to a lost Ireland, or to this sort of vestigial remains of an archaic culture, but it's more about highlighting the possibilities, the utopian possibilities, the transformative possibilities of this collective performance practice, which is rooted in a tradition of women's a protest tradition, of a female protest tradition. The second and last thing that I would say is that one of the great miracles of the book was that when it was finished or nearly finished, I came across the latest translation of Martin Audieron's 1957 poem, Almost Though John Millington Synge, and across the 2018 Vox Hybrida series that Alice Maher, by Alice Maher, and that Alice Maher has talked about. Of Frank Sewell's translation of Martin Audieron's poem, I would like to quote two lines that capture the spirit of Synge's work as I understand it. You never heard the stone's story. The fireside tale caught your ear. And as regards Vox Hybrida and the broader series of Vox Materia, I feel, Alice, that your exploration of the aesthetic and political potential of recalcitrant objects, of hybrid forms, as you put it, resonates very much with the argument that I tried to articulate in the book. I love the way Vox Hybrida problematizes the body, refuses to see it as self-contained, as a fixed entity, and affirms the transformative possibilities held by moving bodies. And it's not just for the individual, but most importantly for the collective. So this is an area in which I think, this is an area that is very congruent with the argument of the book, and my interest in the promise of social reconfiguration that performance holds. Another aspect, if I may, I'll be just one last thing, is another aspect of the work, Vox Hybrida, that I find thought-provoking and challenging, has to do with its engagement with the past and with the source of inspiration that you've recalled, this 12th century figure in Kilcooley Abbey. And your work doesn't, it's not an invitation to apprehend the past as a frozen memento, as disjointed from the present, but on the contrary, as retrieving the agency of the past in the present, and as acknowledging that the past is a force within the present, and therefore seeing things anew. So basically that's all I wanted to say. But I think that Vox Hybrida and all that you've said tonight about the book, opens the book scope beyond theatrical performance, and highlights its relevance for thinking of collective identities, female collective identities, as not fixed, but as fluctuating, and therefore as open to change. So that's it. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Hélène. And so our panelists, if you can rejoin us with your cameras on. The other thing we thought we would do is to invite the attendees. If you want to raise your hand, there's a kind of, if you put your cursor down, you'll see there's a yellow raise hand, and then we can sort of admit you as a panelist, and you can be more present and sort of, thanking Hélène for her book and contribution. So I'll invite the attendees if you want, and David can kind of behind the scenes, promote you to being a panelist. But we have time for some questions. I think we should take a few extra minutes to engage with a few of the themes that have come up. I know that a few things that have struck me, and there might be stuff that you folks want to bring up as well. The question that I had, I was interested in, is what I take to be, maybe this is my own imagining of Synge, but Synge's self-consciousness, or what I think of as Synge's self-consciousness as a human being, which maybe came up a little bit in Adrian, your quotation of those passages. Is that a way of characterizing him? And if so, how does the inhibited quality that goes with self-consciousness that prevents performativity? Is that something that draws him to theater? I don't know if you'd go along with that, Hélène, or maybe Adrian would like to comment on that.
Well, I read about things, you know, actress Moira Schuler, for example, mentions in her memoir, or in it, that Synge was very silent. He would sit in the back and observe. So, you know, whether it was self-consciousness or not, but I think it was also a way for him, I don't know, to open things up for others, and to, you know, so I don't know, that would be my answer to that. But
yeah, Adrian, do you have a take on that? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's a simple answer to that. I mean, I've often had a suspicion. There's a wonderful short story in French, or kind of set piece, kind of sambalist short story in French that Synge does, I guess probably in the 90s. I'll have to go back and check, but in which there's a kind of weird performance that goes wrong. There's clearly a violinist or something like it on stage who's performing, and it just goes wrong. And even though there are moments where it seems to go right, it goes wrong. So I always had this kind of sneaking suspicion that was autobiographical, and he was trained to perform, but had kind of stage fright when it comes to actual musical performance in a big context. Like, it's, you know, it's a kind of, everyone's watching you, the kind of awful thing that happens to us all sometimes, that everyone's watching and you do something disastrous. And that maybe in some weird way that contributes to him going from music to a consideration of what performance is, which is part of his journey being a playwright. I have no idea really if that's true, though. I think that's just a kind of suspicion. But I certainly, I mean, Hélène's book is beautifully done in that it draws out Synge's, well, not only self-consciousness but consciousness of all kinds of performance, and that seems to be just a really interesting way of thinking about how Synge observes people, but then observes people observing him, and this kind of reflective thing keeps going. And that's clearly, his silence was clearly a way of doing that, but he clearly also had kind of an affinity that with people. He was able to sit silently and observe them in a way that mattered, I guess. I don't know, but that's my feeling. I don't know. Yeah,
maybe I could ask Alice a little bit about that. And this sort of, I guess it's a good, interesting question of self-consciousness, like consciousness of the self, as seems to be a very productive thing in your art practice, but also embodiment is not just, you know, in the head. But yeah, I don't know if you had thoughts on that dimension of how that can be a productive aspect of artistic creation.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about it there. Dan, there's a kind of a point when you're making what you're doing, you know, you're performing, when you're not really conscious of where you're going or where you're coming from. You're actually just being a body, you know, like moving, you know. So, you know, you're not, even though you set out to represent the self or somehow engage with the self, there's a point when the self disappears into something. It's hard to describe what that is, but if you ever perform, I'm sure you do, you know where that is. It's like the time that isn't time, you know. That's the kind of time for the wormhole to me, you know, where something comes in from outside, underneath, you know, wherever it comes from, the past or the future. And then that becomes part of yourself at that moment. You know what I mean? Like, my point really is that the self is never a full and whole being. The self is more like a sieve, you know, or a sponge, or stuff that moves through it, you know, and it can expand to include massive amounts of stuff, you know, and that can include objects, you know, like Adrian, or not, like Shaun was saying, or, you know, and it can, you know, include that point where his bow, you know, touched the nets overhead, you know, that affected his body. You know what I mean? That didn't just stop him playing or something, you know, that was like something that entered the self, you know. So everything you touch, you know, every orifice, every pore of your skin is a connector, you know, to otherness, you know, outside of yourself. And if it's open, you know, that's kind of getting in. And it gets in, I think, a lot more in performance as you move. And that's in a way why I moved around, you know, to get those different shapes. It's just a way of letting go of the pose, you know, the pose, like now, like we're posed, you know. So you're just letting go of the pose and let something happen. And it was the same with the use of the wood in a way. So just allowing that to happen and going, oh yeah, you know,
And
you know, I've been surprised in a way that that could come in, you know, like Hélène says, you know, like something from, it's like prehistory is history, you know.
And that I think connects, Shaun, with that was really interesting, your observation about the film version and its relative tidiness compared to the Druid production. And I was just kind of curious about how do you account for the tidiness of the film version? I mean, it was just a matter of propriety, or I don't know, something else.
I think Adrian Frazier, who of course is out there in Galway with you, has written about this and argues that it's part of a tourist industry initiative. And if you decided you're going to attract people to Galway by a Druid production, come and live in a dirty shebeen and have people being really grubby and with fleas and lice, you probably wouldn't get very far. But if you've got lovely Colleens walking around in red dresses on sunlit sands, you know, it's a much more attractive proposition. You probably know that. Well, should we say that's the truth? It is like that in Galway.
Oh, we couldn't possibly comment on conflict of interest, perhaps. Yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion, but I find that intriguing. Yeah, Adrian, I had a question as well about the illustration of the fiddler, the Jack B. Yeats one. It seems like a box-shaped fiddle. I guess it's sort of slightly funny, and then there was a shape just beneath or below where the woman is sitting, which seems to have more of the shape of what we think of the body of the instrument of a fiddle. But I don't know whether is there something ethnographic about the shape of that instrument, or
I imagine it's what people might call a box fiddle, which is sort of rather hacked together. I mean, it's interesting because Helene's book doesn't mention violins, but that's kind of my own personal interest. Sorry, everyone, to bore you about violins, but it's a kind of whether a violin is a fiddle makes it seem kind of more folkish, and so Synge starts calling it a fiddle, even though he's a classically trained violinist. To have a box fiddle is even more kind of spontaneous and full of sprezzatura and kind of making do. So it's a really interesting object. I mean, actually, Helene's book talks more about kind of things of modernity, like a clock, or a watch, I should say, and a camera, and those kind of things, and how they kind of mediate between, I don't know, the past and the present, but also a kind of spatial sense of the world. I think that's interesting. But actually, I see that there are other questions. I don't want to talk too much about the violins because it's my concern really. But yeah, I think they're both observing how modernity knocks things about. You can maybe say there's a kind of odd recycling in having a box fiddle in certain ways. So I think there are certain things in the book that resonate now about how we deal with objects and revivals and things. Anyway.
This question has come in from Chris Morash, and Chris is asking, he said, first of all, thanks for the fascinating papers. The question occurs to me, to what extent is the kina not just about sound, but also movement, and hence a form of dance, which suggests that Synge's plays might not be so far from Yeats's theater practice? I know that's a subject he's working on, and we will look forward to imminent pronouncements from Chris on that theme. But Hélène, I don't know if you wanted to take up that question of how we should think about that.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, the keen interests me in that it is a complex performance in itself. It's singing, music, poetry, and dance at the same time, and a form of this moment when people lose consciousness, as Alice was saying. You know, when you achieve a form of trance, and so as to allow for something else to happen. So it's a dance of a special kind, which is also I can't say more than that, but it is what interests me in the keen is the imbrications of different performance tradition. Keening itself is a hybrid performance tradition. That's
Thank you. Sue Jones has a question. So Sue, yeah.
Oh, hi, and congratulations, Hélène. It sounds wonderful, and this has been a wonderful panel. Thank you so much to all of you. It seems to me to bring together that phrase that you mentioned, Hélène, the possibilities of moving bodies, more so than anything else. I was particularly initially interested in what Alice was saying about portraiture and the way in which she, hides the face. And it just reminded me for a minute of Vanessa Bell's portrait of Virginia Woolf sitting in a deck chair, in which, we don't see the face at all. It's a blur. And what we see is the movement of the body on the deck chair. Now, this seems to me to link up to what Synge is doing, Hélène, in his plays, and particularly those moments of keening. Certainly in the Druid production that I saw of Riders to the Sea, that really came to the fore at the end. The movement of those bodies as a chorus, the trance that you were mentioning, which is highly kind of Nietzschean, Dionysiac in a way, that sense of the Dionysiac happening there. But it seems also that it's carried through in a tradition of Irish theatre. I think through Beckett, I was thinking of Lucky's dance as a disruption, a complete disruption, a performative disruption within the performance itself in Waiting for Godot. And they could even be going to the fair, couldn't they? Old Pozzo with his whip, so on. But when Lucky does that dance, it's the only moment in Beckett, as far as I know, that's improvised. I'm not sure, you would know better than me. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Bye.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So Ellis, would you like to comment on that, on the moving bodies?
I'm not too sure what I could what I could say about that, but I don't know. Those drawings that I showed when I said that I do drawing, these three large figures, which are called ombre, for me, they did represent a type of keening figure, this kind of great hair covered, powerful ombre, like a shadow or a shade of something else. And it's true that generally speaking, keeners would release their hair, as almost like an electric, connection, to something else that wasn't tied or contained. So there's just that kind of great release of bodily extensions, or something. So I think in movement, or in keening or in excess, you can like extend the body into a massive scale and spatial, where you take over, space, like his mass of women who stooped down at the door. I think, as you were describing, Adrian, I think it was, like they massed at the door like a type of one creature, So yeah, I'm really interested in that idea of expanding into space, your body expanding out into space and taking over the energy, of space. So
I'd say also, Susan, thanks very much for your comments. What I'm interested in is how moving bodies refuse to be pinned down to something and to be made to say something. And the dance in Beckett is a disruption. It's a disruption of rationality as well, when the speech goes all over the place. So it does expand to another frame of understanding the world, and that's. So it really, thanks for your comments.
Andre, if I could come to you, joins us from Prague. So Andre, your question.
Thank you very much, and huge congratulations to Hélène, and hello to all the speakers, and thanks for your great contributions. This has been really fantastic. I have just a quick question to add to the discussion of the keen. Hélène, or maybe even Shaun, are you aware of any productions of Riders to the Sea that have actually attempted the same kind of emotional intensity of that final keen that is described in the Aran Islands? Because in my experience, of course, their productions are hard to come by for starters, But in my experience, even, you know, having listened to recordings from, say, 1950s or 60s for the BBC, the keen was really downplayed. It was more like a sort of mellow soundtrack at the back. And I mean, anytime I would teach the play to students, I asked them to become directors and tell me how they would represent that moment. It just opens immense possibilities. But I haven't seen anything like that on the stage ever.
Hélène, did you want to take that up first?
I was just about to ask Shaun, because he probably has seen
No,
more.
I'm with Andre on that
Yeah.
one. I think this is the point that you make so powerfully. If you downplay it, you acquiesce in the narrative drive to modernity.
Yeah. I don't know, Hélène, whether you've had, encounters with productions.
No, I haven't. I haven't either. And I was struck that in the filmed version in Druid Synge, they've actually curtailed the king completely. I know that in a later production they've attempted, but I haven't seen it myself. I've just read Nicholas Green's on it, and they've attempted to translate that into another form of performance with women banging their hands against the wall, a sort of, hybridization of the Irish keen and the Jewish prayers at the Wall of Lamentation, so another form of lamentation for the dead. But in a way, Andres, the book comes also from the same frustration as yours, and I think what you do with your student, tossing the question back at them, what would you do? Because it is really the moment when a director can sort of, there are other moments as well, but it's, yeah.
Just to note, actually, I should say Hélène's book is really thoughtful on the kind of performance tradition history of the keen. It's not a kind of spontaneous outpouring. It's a thing that requires apprenticeship and work and kind of practice. It's more than just a ritualized tradition. It's a set of performance practices that require kind of work and those kind of things. So it's really interesting on that idea that actually keens are hard to do, whatever theatre performance you're in. You can't just kind of wander in and do a keen. It doesn't work that way. It really requires the kind of in-depth relationship to a tradition that matters. And also, I don't know about performances, that whether the keen is especially good, but one of the reasons why Riders of the Sea is such an interesting play is that it's got all those elements of realism, as Shaun suggests, I think, but also it works really well as an opera. So I give a shout out to Vaughan Williams's opera. I don't know if you've seen that on stage, but it really works strangely well, because in that sense, you've already got a sound world there that exists. So when the keen happens, it happens as part of something else. I mean, it is, kind of its own way, a very different imposed tradition of Vaughan Williams itself. But there is I think there's on YouTube, there must be the RTE version, or maybe it's not on YouTube, but it exists anyway. There's an RTE TV version of that, which is kind of very claustrophobic, but nonetheless has this strange opening out of the moment in music. And it's not by any means an exact representation, but because it has the sense in which this is operatic, that you don't get the sense that people are just crying and emoting. You get the sense that they're doing it within a kind of tradition that's recognizable. So it's a very different version of the play, but I think works because that's sort of in Synge's text already, that possibility.
That's a fascinating idea. I'm mindful of the time. We should probably draw to a close. This has been a fantastic opportunity to think more fully and richly about Synge in so many different dimensions. Just want to send, congratulations to you, Hélène, for this fantastic book and achievements. This is the work of many days. The fact that the Moore Institute had a contribution to it is a source of wonderful, delight and pleasure, but it's really an opportunity to, really think carefully about where you've made your mark in terms of opening up new possibilities of thinking. And this evening's discussion has really done that, I think, brilliantly well, and it's certainly going to take me to the book with great energy and enthusiasm. So we can now, I guess, officially launch, admittedly, COVID delayed and so forth, this book on performance. Thank you, Shaun. Performance Modernity in the Plays of J.M. Synge. So, Hélène, again, wonderful congratulations and well done to you.
Very generous of you. Thank you all. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us, and yeah, be safe and well. See you soon, we hope.
Good night. Good
Good
night.
night.
Good night.